Excellent. Welcome, everybody. I'm Justin, and this is two basics made compelling. In other words, how to take two fairly long existing, kind of basic seeming teaching tools, namely total physical response or TPR, and personalized question and answers or PQA, and make them really work for you personally, for your situation, for your students. I really love as a teacher myself, returning to the basics, returning to bread and butter, and seeing, hey, maybe I stopped doing this at some point because it seemed too basic or it wasn't quite working with my students, but maybe I can go back to that because there's a reason why so many teachers have found it useful over the years. Maybe I can tweak some things to make it the kind of interesting, the kind of compelling that my students need. And so I'm going to share a bunch of ideas about that with you today. JJ also, in her excellent session that just happened about introducing vocabulary, also shared a ton of great ideas about TPR and PQA. We'll dive even deeper in here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get into those details. Okay, let me put this in a way where I can see it well at the same time. So TPR stands for total physical response. As has been mentioned a couple of times, it was developed most publicly by a teacher named James Asher, Dr. James Asher, several decades ago. And he came out with an entire book, this thick, an entire book on TPR. So if you think of TPR as, oh, just a teacher gives some commands and then students do something, if that were the only options, then it wouldn't have yielded a 300-page book. Which means you can go much deeper even than I will in this session, but I will share some more ideas that go beyond that basic command giving. Personalized question and answers is just what it sounds like. It's having conversations with students about their interests, their opinions, their situations. And that's another thing where I hear, it's something I really enjoy doing as a teacher, but I hear from lots of teachers, they try to do that. They try to just get their students talking in interpersonal conversations and things like that. And for some reason, it kind of falls flat. It doesn't quite work. Maybe some students get bored while we're talking with certain students, or students aren't interested in each other's information, or maybe the whole thing doesn't seem worthwhile to students. And I've spent a lot of time kind of diagnosing that in my own teaching and in teachers that I've observed and coached, and come up with a few pointers that I think can help a lot and that other teachers have told me help with their situations as well. So I'm going to give very detailed tips about how you can make that kind of interpersonal communication with students go extra well. First, just a little thing to get us going here. I do have a new puppy. This is Birdie. She was sitting right here a moment ago. I would have picked her up and showed you to prove she's actually mine. I showed these pictures to some participants in the CI Summit conference in person last week that's been mentioned a few times. And one kind of jokester said, hey, how do we even know this is your dog? You could just be showing any cute puppy to make us trust you more and think you're a nice guy. The actual studies have come out, by the way, that if you're ever doing a presentation on Zoom, even if you don't have a dog, if you say, hold on a sec, I gotta go feed my dog real quick, and you do that and come back, people like rate your session as more interesting and more trustworthy. So you can give that a shot if you want. But I do have some photo evidence of me with this dog. In fact, I'm wearing the exact same shirt, I noticed, right now as I was in these pictures, so you know it's me. Am I wearing the same pants? It's a mystery. But this is me and this is Birdie. The cats have mixed feelings about her, but they are definitely kind of interested in each other. So at least they're at peace. Well, I'm someone who, when I think about teaching practice for myself, and when I think about it in terms of how can I help other teachers, is I like to go back to why do we even do a thing? And for me, this helps me get past the question of, hey, is this a good activity or not? Or does this work or doesn't it? And instead to think about, well, why would I do this thing? What is this particular task or this skill good for? If that's something that I want to have happen, then maybe that's something I can use this task for. And so I want to break down the why a little bit of both TPR, total physical response, and PQA. And then we'll go into detail on TPR. That'll be the shorter first section. and then we'll devote more time to PQA. So there are two main reasons that I think of for spending some time, for devoting energy to, and to getting better at TPR and PQA. One is that it builds community, it builds shared memories. If we're talking about PQA, then of course we're learning things about each other, and thus we're becoming more aware of people other than ourselves, more aware of our fellow learners. And that's just interesting. It also makes us more likely to be interested in further information. Once you know a little bit, you might be more interested in knowing more. And it gives us information in the classroom to build on that other students know, and that I as the teacher know. There's that many more things that I can potentially link the content, other content that we learn in class to. So if we're reading a story about a certain thing, or we're looking at a picture about a certain thing, and I know from PQA that a certain student is into that thing, then I can establish that link. And that's something I wouldn't necessarily know if I hadn't created the space and the opportunity for us to learn those things about each other through PQA. So that's one aspect of it. And the other is because it's an active communication. So PQA, that interpersonal communication that we're going to model and talk about, is both, it's already a goal, right? We want to develop interpersonal communication, but it's also a means to soak up the language more and more. And TPR, even more kind of direct, concrete detail, links the sounds that people are hearing in another language to really specific, concrete information or actions. And so it's even though it might seem kind of mechanical at first, it's an active communication that makes possible other communication. And to put all this in context, JJ made a similar comment early, but I have a little graphic laying this out for you. We can think of acquiring a language as roughly following this progression, right? You start with just some individual words and phrases, maybe some things you've memorized, or maybe things you picked up here and there. Then you move to piecing those things together into short sentences, maybe even short interactions. You move on from there to longer interactions and to texts. And then from there to full-length text, articles, books even, and things like that. And TPR hangs out mostly on that individual words and phrases area, or in that phase, and really helps people start to internalize the meanings of those individual words and phrases. And of course, PQA starts to hang out in this area. So PQA, I view it as extra powerful because it's the bridge. We all want to get to the point where students can understand whole paragraphs and students can participate in whole conversations, but there needs to be a bridge from just knowing individual words to being able to use language on that level. And PQA is the perfect bridge because it's that in between, that sort of sentence level, short, scaffolded, careful interactions. And so even if it weren't a chance to talk about really interesting stuff, which it is, it would still be an integral piece in that progression from just knowing a bunch of words to actually being able to communicate. Now, having kind of pitched the idea of this progression from individual words and phrases up to longer in text and discourse, I do want to point out there's more to learning a language, right? It's not just learning words and expanding it like that. There's more. I was just going to say as well that sentences and brief interactions, that's most of how people use language all day, unless you're sitting there reading a book or writing content. And so it makes sense that we would spend a lot of our time on that. And of course, we can use sentences and brief interactions about other content as well. It's not only during that phase. But what I was starting to say is I recognize that there are other elements to learning a language. There are other processes to learning a language. I hate putting culture even just as a thing on the side. I think I've started developing a version of this graphic where culture is kind of a bubble that goes around and through everything, but it was visually a little bit too overwhelming. But of course, all these things can be culturally situated, and especially the farther you get into these higher levels of paragraphs, text, and so on, it'll be more and more culturally bound up in a good way. But hopefully this is a way that when we think about, okay, why would I do TPR? Why would I do PQA? It's because they're so powerful for those first two key phases in moving towards proficiency in a language. So having said all this as background, let's dive deeper into TPR for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll spend the rest of our time on PQA. So here we are on TPR, and hopefully, depending on what you already know about it or what you've tried in terms of TPR, this will give you some whole new ideas for how you can use it, whether it's basically the same format that you already do, but some new ideas for what kind of language you could use, or maybe even some entirely new formats. The way I break it down for myself, this is not something from a book or something like that. This is just how I digest it for myself and how I'll share it with you, is that there are kind of four main types of TPR. I'll give you a sec to glance over those, and then I'll make some comments about each one. So got basic TPR, compound, team, and narrative TPR. And don't worry, I'll make clear what I mean by each of these and give some examples. Then you can decide as you plan your instruction, hey, this would be a great chance for some team TPR. Or, you know what, here's a couple basic words, we'll do some basic TPR and we'll move on. Or, wow, this is a great chance for me to try narrative TPR, and so on. So by basic TPR, I pretty much mean, actually, before I make that comment, with all of these things, if you were in my session with Erica this morning on the science of language teaching and learning, the key that we want to achieve over and over again in order for language learning to happen is that students make this connection between the form of language, in other words, what it sounds like or what it looks like, and what that actually means. And so with all of these types of TPR, we're trying to make that evident. So basic TPR, it's often associated with commands. It doesn't have to be only commands, but it's often associated with commands, especially if we're talking about very physical verbs. So stand up, sit down, turn around, swim, as in just like swim in the air, lots of things like that. Anytime you have a really concrete verb like that, even if you don't have, and I'll come back to this idea at the end of our little TPR phase, but even if you don't have a phase called TPR in your lesson plan, you can still just pause and say, hey, class, show me nadar. That's to swim, and students do this. And so it's not just that TPR can be a line in your lesson plan. It can be something you do anytime to do a comprehension check from everybody. Does everyone get what this word is? To get people up and moving a little bit. It's just handy in those various ways. But it can also be its own line, its own item in your lesson plan. And in that case, you can do the most basic version, which is just some commands. When you're doing that, let's say the action is walk in whatever the target language is, and you can just give it as an instruction, class, walk. And what's often done is the teacher will model what they want students to do when that instruction happens. And then gradually, as they continue to give that command, the teacher will delay doing the action as well. So in order to give the students a chance to just go ahead and do it without imitating the teacher. The teacher can again confirm it by doing the action. That's fine as well. Something I wanted to point out here, and I still consider this basic TPR, is that you don't necessarily, in order to get the benefits of TPR, you don't necessarily have to do kind of a full body version of the action. So you could establish for your class that this is walk, just using your fingers, going along like that. That's just fine. It depends on maybe on the space you have in the classroom. Maybe you do it differently sometimes just to mix it up. But there's actual research suggesting that you get basically just as much benefit from kind of a small scale gesture like this as from doing the entire action. So as you can imagine, then you can layer on items to that command, and I would still consider this basic TPR. You could say, walk quickly, walk slowly, walk like a blank, walk like a rock star, walk like a puppy, you name it. And you can do that partly in order to buy yourself more repetitions of that word walk, but also in order to target whatever phrase might be included. So like a blank, como un, whatever, French, comme un, German, wie ein. and so on, just to get lots and lots of rapid fire exposure to that, that expression. Now, that is a natural bridge to compound TPR, which before I go into the compound TPR, I sometimes because a lot of times we want to use TPR, or it'd be nice to be able to use TPR for things that aren't just action verbs, right? If the word is walk or run or swim or even write or something like that, it's pretty straightforward to do. But what if the verb is want, like to want, to desire something? There's not really, you can't necessarily like see that on someone's face. And in that case, you'll want to give students or have students come up with what's a gesture that we're going to use for that. So maybe it's this, okay? In that case, a lot of times what teachers will do is, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to command people to want something, you can say, show me, and then whatever the word is. So that's a way around that. If you find yourself stuck after this, like, wait a minute, that made sense when Justin was talking about it, but none of these words on my list are things that you can really command someone to do. You can say, show me table, show me wants, show me speed, whatever it might be that you've established as a gesture for that. So building on what we said so far, you can get into some compound TPR. Remember, I pointed out that you can say walk like a puppy, walk like a rock star, you name it. We're going to build on that, make that even more complex with sort of combined commands. So I could say walk and laugh at the same time, or students really like this one, sleep and laugh at the same time, swim and sleep at the same time. But you could also mix it up a bit more and say, okay, walk or swim. Okay, then some students might end up doing the walk, some might do the swim, and you kind of check, and it's just a way of mixing things up. You could say, swim without your arms. That's this without here. And then students will do some other kind of swimming motion. So think about the fact that you can take that main instruction and make it interesting in some way or another using some of these, in this case, it's conjunctions or prepositions. You probably, if you want to do this in your instruction and you haven't done this a lot before, you probably want to script out which ones of these you're going to use, because even if it's very basic commands, it's very easy to freeze up and then on the spot in the moment not be sure what to say. Another example of compound TPR might be something like go to the window, then tap your nose. So some other kind of sequence, or first go to the window, then tap your nose, finally go back. Any way that you want to work in some more language like that. You don't want to do it too much longer than that, or else it becomes a memory exercise. But again, that's what I mean by compound TPR, kind of combining multiple commands that have some relationship to each other. And that takes us into one of my favorite versions of TPR that I learned from, I don't know if he invented it, but I learned it from Jason Fritz, who's a great Spanish teacher out in Southern California, which I'm calling team TPR. And what you do here is you break the class up into 2 or 3 groups, teams, as it were. When I learned it from Jason, he chose different countries where Spanish is the predominantly spoken language. So it's maybe like Mexico and Guatemala, let's say. I often will use a certain city. So I teach Latin, and there I'll often use Rome as one city and Carthage as another city, because they were like sworn enemies, which added an interesting element. And what this allows for is, let's say this half of the room is Rome. This half of the room is Carthage. I can say, Rome, stand up. Rome, sit down. And they're just doing it with the other group watching. Then I turn and say, Carthage, stand up. Carthage, swim. But then, not only can I just mix it up by doing that, but I can actually use the techniques I mentioned a moment ago of compound TPR to make it a bit more interesting. So I can say, Carthage, while Rome swims, you walk. And then I turn to Rome and I say, swim. So then Rome starts swimming and Carthage walks because it's while Rome swims. I might say, after Rome swims, you walk. Then I say, Rome, swim. And only once I tell Rome to stop swimming, then Carthage starts walking. So see how I can go back and forth like that. Instead of regions, you can have it be animals. Maybe one group is bears, the other group is cats. One group can be the green group, or the other group is the blue group. Anything, any kind of language that you want to work in. Well, this team TPR version will give us a transition into the final version that I'm calling narrative TPR. Here again are some examples of the conjunctions that you can use for that team TPR. Oh, actually, let me mention this one too. So it could have I could say Rome, Rome sing, Carthage sing louder than Rome, or Carthage sing slower than Rome, or whatever else it may be. So you can work in lots more modifiers, whatever it is that you want your students to be establishing that key form meaning connection with that's on the bottom of the screen there. So transitioning that into narrative TPR, picture the scenario. I'll show you a team version of it and a non-team version of it. Picture a scenario where we had that Rome and Carthage. Here's a version of that I've often done using TPR, but starting to turn it into a story. So I might say, Rome, sleep. Okay, then Rome pretends to sleep. Everyone on the Rome side pretends to sleep. Carthage, stand up and slowly walk to Rome. So they stand up, they slowly go over. Already we have a little bit of suspense, like what's going to happen while the Romans are sleeping, right? And so just those two sentences of team TPR, Rome, sleep, Carthage, stand up and slowly walk to Rome, has created the beginning of a bit of a narrative. And if you want to take it farther, you'll probably want to script it out based on either events or vocabulary that's going to make a lot of sense in whatever you're talking about in your class those days. Be Carthage, stand up and slowly walk to Rome. Rome, wake up. Rome, look at Carthage. Carthage, wave your fist at Rome. Rome, scream. And however I want to build that up using language that's going to appear in the story and so on. See how that begins to turn to a narrative. We can also do narrative, and this is how I first saw it. The first time I saw this masterfully done was a French teacher in Colorado named Sabrina Sebenyansak, who's again a French teacher. She's from France but teaches in Colorado, and this tends to be done usually in the third person, where the TPR is kind of a visual aid that only certain students are doing. So this might be, I have a certain student, everyone else is sitting and just paying attention, and I have a certain student, maybe that student's name is Susanna, and I say, Susanna stands up. Again, this is, I'm telling a story in the third person, but Susanna is listening to the actions that I say and doing them. So that's the TPR. And then it's a narrative because students are going to watch it unfold. So I say, Susanna stands up, and she does. And I say, Susanna is tired. Susanna shows herself being tired. Say, Susanna walks to the window and opens the window. Susanna looks out. And maybe I can even combine this now with a little bit of class input. I say, class, what does Susanna see outside the window? And whenever I ask an open-ended question like that, I'll do this kind of drawing motion, sort of giving me your ideas. So students will say a bunch of ideas until I hear one that I like. I say, and say, class, that's right. Susanna looks out the window. Susanna sees a magic squirrel, or whatever it is that students came up with. And that continues. Susanna screams. Susanna holds the squirrel. Susanna takes the squirrel back to her chair. Class, are Susanna and the squirrel friends or enemies? They give me ideas. That's right, they're best friends. And so see how we've taken the idea of those same TPR action words, but we're starting to make a little story out of it. And of course, you could do that with multiple characters. You could make everything plural by having two people do all those things together, and so on. So hopefully that gives you some ideas beyond sort of the classic, just say some basic verbs as commands, and that's TPR, and then you move on. That's perfectly fine to do, but there are ways that you can mix it up like that. Now, how would you have decided which words to use? That would be based on whatever the keywords in your unit, whatever words are going to be in a story that you have coming up. On that note, by the way, if you use the Voces curriculum, Nuestra Historia or Notre Histoire, Unsere Geschichten, Nostra Storia, those story-based series in German, French, Spanish, or Italian, also English for that matter, there are before every story, there's a section called Important Vocabulary, Vocabulario Importante, that gives you TPR tips for those exact words. I might actually have this pulled up here. Yeah. So here I am logged in, and I can show you all this later in more detail as well. But if I'm logged into a Voces title and I go in the directory to one of the stories, so in this case, I chose Petite Histoire 2, Alors on danse, which is one of the stories in the French 2. If I click that to expand the elements of that story, then the very first one will be Vocabulaire Important, in Spanish, Vocabulario Importante. And when I click that, it will show me what's the key vocab for that story. And then in this yellow box, which anytime you have anything in a yellow box, it means only teachers can see it. When students are logged in, they don't see it, only teachers do. It will give you first some tips on how to do TPR, and then for each of the key expressions, some ideas for what gesture you could use if you don't want to make it up yourself or have students make it up, in case you want to do TPR with those words. A quick kind of pro tip there. It will usually give you one for every single expression here, but for me personally, I would only pick the ones that seem to lend themselves best to TPR to teach in that manner. The same page has lots of other ways that students can engage with that new vocab, but I wanted to make sure you knew that it's on that important vocabulary page for every single short story that you can find some TPR tips. So switching back, I have one last pro tip for TPR, and then we'll switch gears and talk about PQA. So this last pro tip, I'm going to call it recycle, recycle, recycle. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean two main things. One is whenever you're doing TPR anyway, don't just use whatever that new vocab is that you plan to introduce with TPR, but also use recent vocab that you've done as TPR. So if you did some TPR yesterday, then work in some of those words as well. If you did some last week or 2 weeks ago, work in that as well, partly to keep that alive and partly to give you more ways to mix it up. Because if you have, let's say, 4 new vocab items you're going to do TPR with, that's not that many things. There's not that much interesting stuff you can do. But if you take it as an opportunity to recycle stuff that you've done in other TPR recently, that'll give you more interesting things you can do in that one session, and it will keep some of those words alive in students' minds. The other sense in which I mean recycle here is, let's say that as some part of your lesson plan early in the period, you did TPR in one or more of the ways that I just said. Well, later on, let's say you're reading a story and one of these words comes up. Then right then, as you're reading the story, say, hey, class, show me walk like a rock star. Okay, students get up and they do the walk like a rock star thing from before. Just a way to link what's happening in the story here and the language in the story to the meaning that they already established. That's partly just for review, and it's partly because it's harder than we might think for students, especially with languages new to them, for students to kind of transfer it over into a new context. So just because students were fine with it kind of orally doing the actions based on the commands doesn't necessarily mean that when they see that word in writing in the middle of the story with a high cognitive load based on everything else that's going on in the story, that they're going to make that connection. But doing really quick TPR of just that word again right now is a way to kind of re-enliven that in students' minds. Okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's actually, as a form of TPR, hold on, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to do as a whole separate TPR related thing. Let's see if I can spotlight myself for everyone. Looks like I can't, but I may be big enough anyway. If there's a host here who wants to spotlight my video so that it's showing big for everyone, go ahead. But just as a brain break, oh, thank you, excellent. Just as a brain break, we're gonna play a break called Mirror. I see people asking, actually, I'm going to address this really quickly. I see Marta and other people responding about do that TPR stuff in the target language. Yes, 100% in the target language. And Gordana, that's teaching those small words is exactly the point. So if you're going to do the compound TPR that is like while Rome swims, you dance. The reason why I would do that is partly in order to use TPR to teach those small connector words like while, after, louder, etc., that don't necessarily otherwise come up in TPR. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You would need to make sure to clarify the meaning of those function words. And that's a big part of the point of it, is to work function words into TPR, not just action words. Yeah, absolutely, sure thing. So this is a break called Mirror. You can do this in person as well, with you standing up front, or a student coming up and standing up front and doing it, or students can do it in pairs. All we're going to do is you're going to be my actual mirror image, and this will work whether you have your camera on or not. So if I do this, you from your side would be mirroring that action. You're trying to be my mirror. I'm going to go like this. Very nice. Excellent. So that's just a way to refreshing the body, refreshing the brain. Again, that's something you do in pairs. You can do and have some student come up and lead that. You can do 2 or 3 rounds, whatever you want. It's a very simple brain break, doesn't require any cognitive energy or anything like that. Let's dive into the second portion, which is, oh yeah, hope for that one. It's no words. This one here is specifically it's actually intentionally just giving our brains a break from the language, from the fact that there's sound going on all the time. It's giving us kind of a calm moment of break. It's almost like a little yoga break. Yeah, exactly. You could do build in some breath work, a breathing version. Absolutely. Love the way you're thinking about that. Okay, let's head on over to break down PQA. Just like I said at the beginning with TPR, I like to think about now, why might I use this in my classes, and what do I need to do to prepare? What do I need in order to make it go well? And sometimes I almost overthink it, but I overthink it so that maybe you don't have to, and you have an easy time thinking about kind of what all the options are. So when we're doing personalized question and answers, in other words, interpersonal communication with students in class, we got to have something to talk about. That's the first answer. And then we got to know how we're going to talk about it. In other words, we got to have content and we got to have method, content and manner, right? So we're going to break all that down and especially how, as part of the how to talk about it, how to support students' ability to talk about it, which of course is the main thing. So what to talk about? What's this symbol from math mean? Yeah, it's the infinity symbol, right? And one of the great treats we have as language teachers is if we do it in the target language using using kind of a mix of language students already know plus a little bit of new language, then we're by definition on topic. We can talk about anything we want, doing it in the target language, we're scaffolding, and we're doing our jobs. That's something that, let's say, a history teacher doesn't have that same luxury. They can certainly tie things into students' lives and so on, but they got a specific event they got to teach and so on. In our classes, we have an infinity of options for things we can talk about. That the one downside of that is it can be overwhelming to know, well, what out of all those options, what should I talk about? So we'll get into some detail on that. The other half that we need to know is how to talk about it. And on this half, I want to help us on how do we support students' comprehension? Because interpersonal communication has a comprehension element and a production element, right? So how can we help students understand during that interpersonal communication process? And how can we help students produce? How can we help students communicate productively, in this case, orally? So we're gonna, in order to make this a bit more concrete and so that I'm not just talking at you the whole time, we're gonna make this a bit more interactive using the chat. In a moment. First, just a reminder, we can talk about absolutely anything. Here, we're going to use one specific example, 1.5 examples to kind of get across the how-to, the ins and outs of PQA. And you could take those techniques then and apply them to any other of these topics that you might be talking about. And for the how to talk about stuff, we're going to keep in mind, I'm going to give lots of other add-on skills and ways to support students, but keep in mind that the #1 way to make PQA work well is to ask good questions. Both the initial question, that's the conversation starter, and then our follow-up questions. And so we're gonna, the rest of our time, much of the rest of our time is gonna be almost like a question asking clinic, helping us come up with good questions and follow up on them. To help us do that, we're gonna talk about this picture for just a couple of minutes. If you would, in the chat, type as many as you want, but at least a few, as many questions as come to mind for you. These could be sort of comprehension questions like what color is the sky, or they could be things that you actually wonder about this picture. So any or both of those types, let's fill the chat with lots of questions that come to mind. Love it. Yeah, where is this? Who's the artist? What's the monument? Several, where is it? What colors? Whose hands? How long has it been there? Do you like it? Yeah, where is this? What's the material? How many people are here? Love it, love it, love it. So we could rapid fire tons and tons of questions like this. And what I want us to do is consider how we might use different ones of those questions, why we would sometimes use certain kinds and sometimes other kinds in the process of getting students to the point where they can ask and answer interpersonal questions about this in a way that stays interesting and where they understand what's going on. Let me see some of the others. Yeah, where are the people going? Who made this? How old is this? Is it actually a painting? What are people wearing? ¿Cómo son las manos? Or what are the hands like? Is this even a real photo, right? A question that we often find ourselves wondering these days, or is it like a deep fake? Yeah, what's it over? How many people are there? And so on, right? So researchers, like people have actually, education researchers have actually gone into classrooms and watched master teachers at work and have identified there's 2 main types of questions that teachers ask, good teachers ask. Now, there, in a way, there are more, you could break it down in other ways, but they identify 2 special types. I'm going to tell you the names just in case you ever want to look these up. I don't find these names very helpful because to me, they don't really communicate what is meant by these. But anyway, researchers break down questions that we might ask about a person, about a picture like this, about a text, etc., into 2 main types. The first called a display question, and this is kind of like a comprehension question, like just show me, like I can see what color the sky is in the picture. I'm asking you to tell me, right? It's, you could say it's not a real question, but it is a real question. I'm making sure we're on the same page. So this, again, the person asking the question knows the answer, and I'm maybe not quizzing you, but I'm making sure that you know it too. The other type, which is called referential officially, but to me that doesn't mean much. This is one where I don't know what you're going to answer, and I'm genuinely curious about what you answer. So some of the questions that were here in the chat that you had, there was one, someone had like, would you like to go here? Or why are the people here? I don't necessarily know why the people are here. I'm curious why you think the people might be here. Even if it's how far does it go or where does the bridge go? If the picture itself doesn't show it, I'm still going to be curious in what your answer to that might be. So again, that's that referential question type. If you want, you can think of a display question. Show me you know. Okay, what color is the sky? You say blue. Okay, great. You showed me you knew. And now we can move on. The other one is help me know. I don't know. I want you to help me know your answer to this question. And what's interesting is, because we think of probably display questions as these are sort of lower level thinking, the referential ones are higher level thinking, but they're actually both really valuable in making a learning session work. And I want us to think about that for a moment. Oh, here I mean, you came up with great ones yourself. I brainstormed for myself a few of these questions as well. You can kind of skim these. You all came up with a lot of questions that were kind of like this as well. So you can see how, especially the questions on the right-hand side, these could make for some pretty good conversation, right? If I ask my students, hey, would you like to go here? Maybe I get some people like, no, it looks scary, or yeah, I'd love it, or I would, but my next trip's already planned, or who knows what. So that could make for some interesting conversation. And I just want to remind us before kind of moving on from this point that um, oh, this by the way it's in the Notre Histoire curriculum. Any guesses, by the way, what country this might be in and why it might be in a French curriculum? Maybe seen this before. I had actually not seen, even though it looks like it could be a very famous landmark, I hadn't seen it until I discovered it in this curriculum. This is in Vietnam. And the reasons in the French curriculum is because of the French colonization of Vietnam in the 20th century. Ooh, Antarctica. I like the pun, Chris. Oops. I was going to point out really quickly that both types of question are important because what might be lost if we skip straight to sort of the more interesting questions, what would be lost if we, any thoughts from you all about why even bother with some of these display type questions that we already know the answer to? Feel free to throw in the chat if you have some thoughts on that. Why bother with some of these simpler ones? Yeah, absolutely hope so. Differentiation. So throw some kind of gimmies that so people can have that success experience related to that. Sue is reviewing. I want to get the key vocabulary into students' minds so that we can then speak more creatively. Yeah, focusing on specific vocab, April, exactly. Yeah, Laura, it establishes this kind of group understanding of what we're even talking about, clarify things. Yeah, some comfort and confidence. Exactly. Love it, love it, love it. Just sheer vocabulary practice, Cesar. Exactly, exactly. So don't feel like you're, I don't know, not asking intelligent enough questions if you ask these kinds of questions. However, do make sure to get to the other type as well, these kind on the right-hand side. You can imagine without the ones on the right-hand side, we're not actually learning more personal information about students. We're not actually probably talking about content or themes or things like that. And we're not doing much higher order thinking. So I know that you instinctively would kind of work your way towards these kinds of questions because they're valuable in that way. I want to make one more point about question types, and then I want to leave us with some really specific pointers for how to support students' production, as in, starting first, support students' comprehension of the questions, of things other people are saying, and so on, during an interpersonal discussion that this might lead to, and then how to support students' production, help that make it easier for them to participate. So first, the wrap up. This is just another one of the images. This one's from the Spanish curriculum. The Islas de los Uros and el Lago Titicaca in Peru. Erica in one of her sessions, I think, was sharing something about this, or maybe in the opener. This is one of those panorama pictures. I think the other one was as well. So every unit and every language has, at the end, one or more of these very striking images that you can actually, not here in this presentation, but if you were on the website, you can actually turn around 360 degrees and zoom out and things like that. So that's a great place, a great thing to use as a conversation starter. But here's the point I want to make. This might be when people have told me and asked me to observe them teaching to see like why is their interpersonal conversation discussion maybe falling flat in their classes. This might be the number one factor that I've noticed. And so I want to give you some diagnostic questions that you can use for if you find yourself either planning a lesson or doing a lesson and then saying, I don't feel great how that went. I thought it was gonna, I wonder why it didn't. These are some things you can ask yourself. And it refers to this concept of the stakes. This terminology comes from gambling. I'm not talking about gambling in school, but the terminology comes from gambling, right? It's what's on the line. What can you win or lose by participating? And students, even if they don't think about it consciously, anytime a student is in a class and they're asked to speak or they're asked to participate in a game or whatever it is, there's this subconscious, usually subconscious, maybe conscious, but usually subconscious calculation that goes on about like, well, what good thing could happen to me by participating and what bad things could happen to me by participating. And we can't control that 100%, but there are some ways that we can kind of make it so that it feels good enough to participate, but also not too risky. So stated this way, a lot of times personalized Q&A can fall flat because it feels like there's too much at stake or there's not enough at stake. And that can be because of the content of what we're talking about or because of the format of how we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a couple examples so that you can maybe self-diagnose and turn some dials on the stakes when you are having these kinds of conversations with students. So first, on the content side, stakes can be too low because the content's just not interesting or it's too easy. So for example, if we're talking about appearance and the vocab words that relate to that, and I'm going around the class asking students, what color is your hair? But we can all see what color the student's hair is. The stakes probably aren't high enough. Then there's kind of like a language practice element, but there's not actually an interesting reason to participate. Yeah, and Marta, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think this item right here about trying to raise the stakes a bit for students, this could help you out with that. Might not answer every single issue, but this could help with that. And so making sure that the questions we ask aren't things that everyone can just like, especially if we're trying to have personal conversation or interpersonal conversation, that the questions aren't just things that we can all see anyway, or that students don't really care about. So that would be a way that having the stakes be too low and therefore students don't participate. The flip side is if the stakes feel too high and students don't want to participate because maybe the question's actually more personal than we realized, or we're asking way too many levels beyond of a student. And I don't want to give a ton of different examples here because this is something that you all can gauge based on your situations here. But a lot of topics related to money or related to family, for example, can be ones that might seem to us as teachers like, oh, it's just a topic we're talking about. But for a student, that might be almost like too close to home. And so it feels risky or a downer to talk about. Let's say ask even a question such as, what would you do if you had $1 million? I'm not saying that's a wrong question to ask, but I do want to think about the stakes involved. If I have some students in my class who actually do have $1 million and other students in my class who are never going to see $1 million in their whole life ever, that's a very different question for those two categories of students. Again, I'm not saying don't ever ask it, but I have become very careful and try to be very thoughtful whenever I'm asking questions that relate specifically. Yeah, so Marta, it could be very extreme. Some students might not have a home even where they live, and we're asking about this, why them to like imagine all the fun stuff that they would do if they had $1 million when they're hoping they'll have a couple dollars to feed themselves and their siblings or something like that. So I don't want to be preachy about that one. I just want to kind of give you all a heads up about go through that process of thinking about what are the stakes maybe for students in that situation. The other side of this is even if the topic is yeah, exactly, Rebecca. So we want to, as much as we can based on our training and further training, have our teaching in this area be trauma informed. So sometimes the topic is just fine, but the format of the activity has the stakes feel too high. So for example, if I'm walking around and I have a clipboard and it looks like I'm like taking off points or doing some other thing, students can't see what it is, but every time a student says something, I'm like, and I'm doing something on my board, that makes it kind of an awkward situation, might make a student feel like, wait, what am I doing? That will I get a check mark or not? And so on. So I try to have the format be kind of as natural a format as possible without some of these extra educational layers on it. That doesn't mean that you can't mentally keep track of who's speaking and things like that. But that's just one little example there. And related, how do I make sure that a variety of students is included? So this transitions a bit into our last point of how do we support students' comprehension and production. But maybe sometimes I'm asking the whole class these questions. Maybe sometimes I'm asking an individual student. Maybe I'm asking the whole class, but instead of the same certain students always volunteering, I'm having every student write their answer to the question on one of these mini whiteboards. And then I count 3, 2, 1, and they hold up whatever answer they had. That's the way that every single student is participating. It can also lower the stakes a little bit because students don't immediately have to speak out loud. They can, we're going to want to, because this is interpersonal communication, but they'll almost have a little cheat sheet. They'll have an easier time seeing what other students are saying and so on. Yeah, Marta, I love these. These are my favorite piece of one-to-one technology. Like if I had to pick Chromebooks or these things, I pick these things. So last but not least, and I'll give you kind of the overview version of this, and then I'll point out how you can find the detailed information about each bullet point. So this is kind of the very last thing, is this, how do we support students' comprehension and production? Again, because we have only a few minutes, I'm going to give you kind of the overview info on this and show you where to find the more detailed items. So this is kind of a master list that I made of a bunch of ways to support students' comprehension or production, especially during interpersonal communication. A lot of these apply to other settings as well, but I came up with these especially with interpersonal communication. And that's why I have this note here. And again, here, I'm just going to give you these big kind of broad bullet points. Then I'll give you a preview of the more detailed points, and I'll show you where you can find where I've written up more points about each of these things. So basically, to maximize comprehension in these settings is we're going to want to activate prior knowledge. We did that a little bit when we were talking about that picture, right? The one with the bridge, the hand bridge, right? If we're asking stuff about, hey, what color is this? How many people are there? What body part is represented? We're activating some of that basic knowledge that will bring us that much closer to talk about whatever the deeper thing is that we want to talk about. Translanguaging refers to admitting or taking seriously the fact that most of the learners in our room know some language besides the language that we're teaching. And so whether that's providing a quick English translation or other language translation to support comprehension, whether that's letting students look up something really quick in their home language if they need to for understanding, that used to be not considered kind of a best practice because there was a concern about it would be confusing having those different languages floating around. These days, that's considered a good practice because it takes advantage of the linguistic repertoire that students have. Moderating your speech refers to, well, speak more slowly if necessary, do your word choice when you're asking questions and making comments in a way that's suited to those exact students. And last but not least, use gestures. You could also say pictures and other things to clarify what you're talking about. I will go ahead and when you go through, because we're going to share these slides with you, when you go through them, there are notes at the bottom that actually have further, for each of these little things, have further descriptions that I've written out. So you can go to the bottom of the slideshow, and for each one of these items, there's more information that I haven't said about each of those things, about moderate your speech, about gestures, and so on. So you can get more information on it there. That's true also on this side for production, which is the items that I'll close with here, as in supporting students' ability to come up with the language themselves. The huge one that I didn't used to take very seriously is modeling. In other words, me as the teacher basically demonstrating myself talking about that thing. So if I'm asking students to talk about what their favorite TV show was when they were little, then I can say, when I was little, using that target language phrase, right? When I was little, my favorite TV show was Knight Rider or something like that, right? I could put a picture of it if I want or something like that. But just that simple modeling, again, this is another thing. I didn't used to do that much, to take that seriously, because I thought, well, I don't want to make it about me. It's supposed to be about the students. Also, it's my private life and so on. But I realized that when I model that, I'm accomplishing three big things. They might even be written right here. Oh no, this is just how to do it, right? But I am showing what it's like to speak about yourself, about that topic in the target language. B, I'm using the actual words and endings that students would then need to use in order to say those things about themselves. And C, I'm making it so no student has to be the first one in the room to share. And so I don't always do this. I don't always be the first person to answer, but it's a way, if you're realizing, oh, students could use a bit more help with their production, is I can model it like that. Related, there's ways I can provide written support, right, with things like a word wall, or maybe sentence stems that have the beginnings of the answers that students use. If I say, hey, do you so if I say, do you prefer, I don't know, reading or watching TV, I could have some sentence stems in the target language to say, prefiero such and such porque such and such. And I prefer this because this. So that kind of written support. Translanguaging, like I said, is allowing students to draw on additional languages they might know. I might not know those, but other students in the class might. And so they might, maybe one or two words in their answer are in that other language. That's okay, because it helped them use the target language and helped us learn whatever that thing was about them. And last but not least, I already shared this, which is students can answer with the whiteboards or or using gestures or things like that. So with that said, I know that was kind of it was a marathon and a sprint at the same time, lots of info done quickly, but you'll have these slides, you'll have the recording. With the slides, you'll also have some further written up information about each of these ways to support students. And with that, I will go ahead and go to the closing slide here. In case you ever want to contact me directly, you can always contact BOSIS, of course, at info@bosisdigital.com as well, if you want to follow up with me or about the curriculum or anything like that. One last note on the curriculum is, you know how I showed how there is this TPR information on the Vocabulario Importante page. There's also on the very next page, if you click next page here, or if you go to it in the directory, you have the Question Personnelle in the French, or Preguntas Personales page in the Spanish, where it actually gives you a bunch of questions, just like I was asking a moment ago, that you can use that are specifically designed to prepare students for whatever story you're about to read. So a lot of this, the lesson planning element is done for you or assisting you if you use that particular curriculum. So Chris asked, made a little geographical pun, because the bridge is in Hanoi, is in Vietnam. What do you have to fly into Hanoi? A little multilingual pun of sorts. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you to everyone for your contributions in the chat. I know this is getting, depending on where you are, it's kind of like that post-lunch food coma time, but you stuck with it. Enjoy the rest of this day and the rest of this conference. I'm sure I'll see you in some of the other sessions as well. And be sure to check out the recordings and resources and things that we'll be sending out. So thank you, everybody. See you in the next thing. Ciao, adios, adieu, tschüss. Bis zum nächsten Mal. See ya.